Busy week for gun news, which we're going to get into a little bit here because we had the president make two pretty big announcements this week. He announced his new rule on so-called ghost guns, and he also introduced his new nominee to be the head of the ATF. And you wrote a couple pieces about that, if you want to fill us in.
Yeah. So we mentioned this briefly with Cody, but President Biden is now going back to that ATF well. He's nominated another director. His name's Steve Dettelbach, and hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. But he's from Ohio. He was a former U.S. attorney there for, and he's a prosecutor for 20 years. And then he ran for Ohio Attorney General in 2018, where he lost to the current Attorney General, Dave Yost. And now he's been picked to be the next nominee to be the permanent head of the ATF.
Yep. And, there's some things in his past, I think, that you wrote about that might make this. Obviously, we covered the Chipman nomination extensively and how that became a massive political fight just based on some of the comments he'd made, some history in his employment at the ATF, his work for a gun control advocacy organization. But we do see some other issues that you think maybe might come up with Dettelbach as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things actually, but obviously Chipman was a very bombastic kind of guy, and he worked directly for the gun control groups, and he had a lot of, he had some character issues, some accusations that came out about him that, we covered exclusively and extensively. But Dettelbach has his own background that might make it difficult for him to get to that 50 vote threshold, starting with that campaign that he ran in 2018. He took a number of positions on gun control. He was for universal background checks. He was for an assault weapons ban and stricter red flag laws. So those three things are going to probably come up a lot in the confirmation hearing that he's going to get. And, he was also backed by the gun control groups. He was endorsed by them, Evertown and Brady. And so, that's going to be a significant piece of the puzzle here, because obviously one of the biggest complaints about Chipman last time around was the fact that he worked for the gun control groups, and a number of senators, well, all of the Republican senators. And then, I think there were 4 Democratic senators who didn't come out and publicly say they would vote for him, with Angus King, who's technically an independent, but he caucuses with the Democrats, being widely cited as the person who specifically put his foot down to block the nomination. But one of the big complaints was that they don't want a gun control activist in charge of the agency that regulates the gun industry. They think they don't want to politicize that position. And so you still have basically the same core issue here with Dettelbach, and but he didn't work for the gun control groups, but he was endorsed by them, and he does hold these positions. And so it'll be interesting to see how that comes out.
Sure. I think that's exactly right. As we've talked about, and I'll have a forthcoming analysis piece on this as well, about just sort of the timing on this and how, once again, just the politics of gun policy in general will be elevated to the forefront in a big confirmation fight. You've seen the Biden administration expend a lot of political capital over confirmation battles recently, not just Chipman, but there was the high profile defeat of Neera Tanden before Chipman.
Yeah.
And then he had a couple banking nominees that went down for some controversial positions they had taken on regulation. So it is a little bit interesting to see that another high profile fight that obviously it's gun policy. It's going to be pretty contentious and fairly divisive based on party. To see how that plays out will be.
Right. And the thing about that too is it's not clear to me that a lot of these moderate Democrats who had a problem with Chipman want to relitigate all of this again.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Like, they could have nominated somebody like Marvin Richardson, who's the acting director, who's just a lifetime ATF guy, who never been involved in any politics, and he's actually fairly well liked by the industry. But instead, they've decided to go the more political route again. Now, obviously, he has a background as a prosecutor, just like, Chipman had a background as an ATF agent for decades. But the problem is that after those positions, both these guys went into highly political roles. The Dettelbach ran for the attorney general and he endorsed these gun control positions. He was endorsed by gun control groups. And beyond that, we also have a piece where we, pointed out that he used a lot of heated rhetoric during that race, specifically to question the integrity of elections. He repeatedly called Ohio's elections rigged for multiple different reasons. It wasn't just one issue that he thought made the elections fixed, essentially, in Ohio. And obviously, we've seen the outcome of that with January 6th, what that kind of rhetoric can lead to. I know certainly it didn't happen in this case. He didn't.
Sure.
There was no violent riot because of Dettelbach's comments, but I think one of the interesting things to watch here in this confirmation hearing is a lot of the people who are going to be deciding whether or not to vote for him were directly affected by January 6th, the Capitol riot. They were there and experienced the worst case outcome of this sort of rigged rhetoric, right? I mean, if you are telling people that the elections are fake, basically, that they're rigged, that they don't matter, one of the things that can lead to, clearly, is violence. And so I think this sort of rhetoric has become much more taboo on Capitol Hill in the wake of that riot. And, now there's partisan instincts to just sort of wave away when people do this in your own party. So we'll see which of those factors plays out for these moderate Democratic senators, but it's certainly not going to help his nomination, I don't think.
No, I think that's actually a great point. It's that we've seen I think you mentioned in the piece as well, some other instances in the recent past where the sort of rigged election claim has come up pretty repeatedly, but there's no doubt that it's fully on increased public scrutiny at this point, just in the wake of the 2020 presidential election. So that does, I think, in addition to just guns being a tough wedge issue for moderate Democrats, I think that will be an increased factor leading to increased scrutiny. And as you said, political opportunism may take over, but there's just no doubt that that's a big issue now, just the way things have played out the last few elections.
I mean, look, it's one thing to complain about the districting process. Basically, every state's redistricting process is controversial every time it happens. Yeah. Or the way that voter rolls are cleared of people who've moved or whatever. These were the issues that he was complaining about. But it's another thing to use this sort of rhetoric that he did, which is that basically calling into question all of Ohio's elections because he didn't like the way these certain policies played. I mean, he was on the wrong side of the Supreme Court's decision in Ohio's voter roll case, with these comments as well. And then, of course, he dropped them later. He didn't keep saying this, but
sure.
So there's probably very much politically motivated claims, but
sure.
It's just one of those things where this is not the kind of rhetoric that you need to go to if you have a disagreement over how state election laws are playing. I mean, it very much reminds me of a lot of the claims that happened among the more mainstream claims from Republicans about the 2020 election, which was to complain about COVID voting rules, right, which were new and unique. And a lot of people claim that meant the elections were rigged. That was sort of the more serious of the stolen election claims that came up in the wake of Trump's loss. But it's just clearly not necessary and can lead to literal violence, which is why this is relevant, frankly. And politics is a strong thing. It's hard to it's hard to vote against your party's president on a nominee, but I mean, they already did it once with Chipman, and it'll be interesting to see what else comes out about Dettelbach, if he has more stuff that's going to make his confirmation harder or not. But that's something we're going to keep on top of for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. At the same time, Dettelbach's obviously not as bombastic as Chipman, doesn't have the same baggage because he wasn't working for a gun control advocacy organization. But, at the same time, since that nomination failed, we've only seen the polling get worse for Democrats and President Biden in this position where voters increasingly, poll after poll that we've covered, oppose new gun laws. They say they support Republicans in Congress over Democrats on the issue of gun policy. We had that recent poll about new gun owners that are overwhelmingly and at times even more opposed to gun control than previous gun owners. So I think the political environment has gotten only all the more tougher for Democrats trying to push through even a less controversial nomination that still supports gun control. So it'll be interesting to see what the political capital they want to expend on this is, especially in those swing states ahead of the midterms. Right.
Well, and one of the things I wrote about this week for members was the fact that the gun control groups, as we've covered extensively, have been pressuring the president to do this, to do exactly this, to move up the ghost gun kit ban, and then to appoint a second nominee or nominate a second person to be ATF director. And it's paid off. Like they were publicly attacking him. I think both of us thought that was kind of odd strategy,
right.
But it seems to have paid off. So,
sure.
I really didn't think it would, and it did. Now, obviously it's not likely to lead to the long-term goals that these groups have. It's not going to lead to new legislation, but the president did what they wanted. He caved. He brought up a second nominee, even when, frankly, a lot of the complaints that the gun control groups had about his handling of Chipman was weird from the outside, from looking in, because clearly it wasn't Biden who picked Chipman, or he wasn't. It's not as though Biden had no connection to Chipman. As far as I don't think he was a close confidant or anything. It's much more likely that the gun control groups who literally employed him, Giffords, he literally worked for Giffords, but he also worked for Bloomberg's previous groups. And it's much more likely that they suggested he be the nominee, even knowing all of his potential flaws or all of the shortcomings that he had. Not everything was out there about him. Obviously, the accusations of racial bias didn't come until after he was nominated, but a lot of the bigger sticking points were well known. He worked for the gun control groups. He had all these controversial statements he'd made. He did a poor job in the confirmation hearing, but it's weird to blame. If anyone's going to blame somebody for the political fallout of that, it would make more sense to me for Biden administration to blame the gun control groups. But
sure.
But apparently those tactics of going out and publicly trashing the administration, they paid off. And it's very different from how the gun rights groups handled President Trump, right? And frankly, more successful, right? The gun rights groups were able to block a couple of things that Trump wanted to do in terms of new gun control or new gun restrictions, although not all of them. Obviously, the bump stock ban still happened. It probably happened in a way that was more preferable than legislation, but it still happened. And then they never got him, they never really pressured him successfully into doing anything significant for them. They didn't. The ATF director that he nominated got shot down because he was the Republicans feared he wasn't good enough on guns, and he never nominated a second pick. So he was shut down by Republicans. So the strategy difference here is fascinating, and the fact that it paid off is interesting. And what'll be even more interesting is whether or not they get their other big ask, which is for basically a gun control czar.
Right.
They want a cabinet level gun control, policy person, cabinet adjacent, right? It's sort of like, if you remember from the Obama years, he did a lot of the czar positions. It's how much of an impact that has on policy is open to debate, but that's one thing that they really want. You've heard a number of these groups complain. You've written about it. Who were some of the groups? I think it was March for Our Lives was one.
Yeah, some of the smaller groups like Guns Down America and March for Our Lives were really hammering on this point, but it's starting to get picked up as well by the bigger groups, and even some Democratic politicians. Senator Chris Murphy, I think, echoed the sentiment as well. So It's starting to get picked up a little bit as well. It's funny that as soon as they, Biden delivers a big win for them by renominating an ATF nominee, and they once again are back to the same point. Like, okay, great, now create the new cabinet position.
Well, and why wouldn't they, right? I mean,
sure.
Look, they were successful. It worked. We were skeptical that it would have an impact for all the reasons we just talked about, but it did work. And so I don't see why you would necessarily let up. I mean, obviously they were praising him for doing this stuff. It's not all negative all the time. It's just
right.
That I don't see any disincentive for them to do it. It worked this time. Why not continue to push for him to do the other things that you want that he can do, right? I mean, obviously a lot of things they want are like stuff that he can't do, like passing legislation. He's continually called for it. There just aren't the votes.
Sure.
They don't have 60 votes, and they don't have 50 votes to break the filibuster, to nuke the filibuster completely. And so that stuff's out of the realm of possibility. But the thing, they still have these other asks, and I don't see why they wouldn't continue to publicly pressure him on it, because it worked.
Right.
So that's what people should keep in mind. Keep watching for is will President Biden give the gun control groups gun control czar like they want,
right?
A gun czar, and maybe at this point it's possible. Especially what if this nominee doesn't make it through,
right?
The ATF, the confirmation, then that's like one of the only things. If he can't get 50 votes again, I mean, this is really a risk for the president. Like, yeah, Dettelbach's probably a safer bet than Chipman was, but again, the underlying basic problem is still there, which is that he's a gun control activist.
I say you're still asking
a gun control supporter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're still asking Joe Manchin in West Virginia and John Tester in a state like Montana and Maggie Hassan in a state like New Hampshire to take a public vote on a candidate that's called for assault weapons bans and the like. So, the underlying problems are still there for sure.
Yeah. And if he doesn't get through, I mean, that's, the president's already dealing with really bad polling for himself. And it's an embarrassment anytime you can't get one of your nominees through when you only need votes from your party to do it.
Right.
So I think odds on favorite is that he can get through, maybe with one or two Republican votes even at this point. That's like the base level I would think of for a nomination right now. But we'll see how he performs at the confirmation hearing. We'll see what other stories come out about him. And see if it doesn't fall below that 50 vote threshold.
Right. We'll certainly be covering it. So
yeah, because it could be really bad for the president. So he's taking a risk, and he's to satisfy what these groups want. I mean, I'm sure he sees it too as a more of a fighting crime sort of initiative here. These two things together. Obviously we look at them from a gun perspective, but I think the administration looks at it from both guns and crime. There's a murder spike. ATF director is part of federal law enforcement that deals with that. And, ghost guns the ATF claims are becoming a bigger problem in crime. And so, these two things together are probably supposed to be a crime bill, a crime initiative essentially. But I don't know if that's how voters or senators are going to look at this in the end. But we'll keep everyone up to date